Hello, Hellions! In previous lectures, we've been talking about the Norman Conquest, when our Germanic Anglo-Saxons were conquered by William the Conqueror, and about how clever it was that his parents knew to name him that. It's almost like they knew that someday their young Bill would grow up and go out into the world and conquer something or other. That's just what he did. With him, William brought something like 8,000 Frenchmen and the French language, which hit the Anglo-Saxon world like a meteor hitting the earth. The French, actually we should call them Normans, because this is a separate group of people living in northern France and speaking their own dialect of medieval French, Norman French. You recall that they were originally Germanic Vikings who had attacked northern France in around the year 900, and they were given land to settle in exchange for peace to stop attacking. And the people who came from there, even as they learned their own version of French, were called Northmen or, over time, Normans. But since we're talking mainly about language, we'll just call them the French. When the Norman French were finally kicked out of England more than 200 years later, the Normans left behind them about 1,000 stone castles and a very different language. You might say you can take the Normans out of English, but you can't take the Norman French out of English. For more than 200 years, the French was the language of the court, the legal system, the church, the crown, and English was the language of the farmyard, the pew, the peasant hovel. So when the English went back to speaking English again, and we can call this roughly 1250 maybe, they were speaking a new kind of English. It was a much richer language now, one with multiple words for the same thing, like cow and beef, one with new sounds that had not existed before in Old English, and one with tens of thousands of French words that were now English words. It's this linguistic meteor that turned Old English into Middle English, that turned the language of Beowulf into the language of Chaucer. We're going to take our first look at that language, Middle English, by looking at the 13th century Chronicle of Robert of Gloucester. So in the late 13th century, an Anglo-Norman nobleman wrote a history in meter of his country, England, up to about the year 1270, and shockingly, he chose to write in English rather than French. And I know that you would like a picture of Robert of Gloucester so that we can picture the person we're listening to, but I could not find one anywhere. So we'll just assume that he looked something like this. It's pretty to think so. Well, we're going to walk through about a dozen lines of Robert's history, in which he tells about the Norman conquest, and then pauses to reflect on the state of language and power in England in his own time, and then he offers the reader some friendly advice. In your assignment, you should have a handout of this excerpt. You should pause the lecture now and make sure you have that in front of you. I'll ask you to take notes on some words and then to answer some questions. And those questions are, how does Robert associate language with social class in his 13th century England? How might John McWhorter, our linguist from Power of Babel, respond to Robert's opinions about language change in England and other countries? And what is Robert's linguistic recommendation for economic success? And why does that make sense in the England he lived in following 1066? On your right, by the way, is a picture of a stained glass window from Gloucester Cathedral in Gloucester, England, still standing today. Beautiful structure. Before we begin looking at Robert's text and how he describes 1066, I do want to say that I'm not going to be giving you a lot of very technical details about Middle English. There are many dialects, many versions, and there are a lot of details so that it's hard to generalize. But I hope you'll notice that what you see on the screen in front of you looks a lot more familiar than Old English did. Cadman, you might be able to pick out one or two words, but I bet you could get the gist of this by reading it, and once I give you the meanings of the green words, it will seem even more familiar still. So let's start our walkthrough. I'll read a line and translate it, and then go back and make some observations about the green words, which you can mark in on your handout. Thus kom lo Engelond into Normandy's hond. Thus came, lo, what about that? England into Normandy's hand. The first word, actually, notice they're still using the thorn from Old English for the interdental fricative, thus. So thus came Engelland. You can still see the word Angle, as in Angles and Saxons, in the name of the country. It's still visible. What's become England is still Engelland. And it came into Normandy's hand. Notice that Robert does not say that England came into France's hand. He makes a distinction. It's Normandy's hand. William was the Duke of Normandy, not the King of France. Notice also about that word that it's missing a couple of things it would have if we wrote that word today. It's missing the capital letter. That's a much later convention that we capitalize proper names. And it's also missing at the end of the word an apostrophe. It's a much, much later development that we make possessive nouns possessive by adding an apostrophe. The next line is, "Und the Normans ne cuth spake but oa specha." First of all, notice the ampersand, the and. We are still several centuries before the beginning of printing and the advent of paper, so this text would have been written by hand on parchment or vellum, which is animal skin. And the reason I bring that up is that stuff is very expensive. Your material costs are very high. And so you want to save money by reducing the amount of space you use on the manuscript, and thus abbreviations are very common. So that's where and sign comes from. And the Normans, they could not speak anything but their own speech. Couth is interesting. That's the word for could or knew to. If you say couth today, it maybe reminds you of the word uncouth. Uncouth means someone is rude or they don't know how to be polite. Originally, though, the word comes from couth, which meant knowing or familiar. So someone is couth if they do something that is familiar, and they are uncouth if they do something that is unfamiliar. But these Normans, when they came over, they were monolingual, and they couth spake, though only their own speech. But here means nothing but, nothing other than, and the hor is there. Our pronouns are evolving from Old English pronouns to modern English pronouns. In Old English, that would have been he, usually. This is hor, and it's on its way to there. On spake French, as he did at home, and her children did also teach. This is kind of a fun line. They spoke French. He there is they. The dude in this line is just did. Remember, you have to play spin the vowel very often because vowels come and go very quickly. And I'm wondering if anyone can get that next word, atoms. I didn't think atoms would be discovered for many more centuries. No, this is actually two words. It's atome. Can you hear it? At home. A little bit of phonetic writing in there. So they spoke French in England as they did at home, and did also teach to hor is their children. And the effect of all of this is so that high men of this land that of her blood come holdeth alle dulke speech that he of home noma. So that high men of this land that of their blood come, Norman blood, hold all the same speech that they from home took. In Robert's spatial metaphor, there are levels of people. There are some who are high, and there are some who are low. And high people of this land come from Norman blood. And what do these high men speak? Well, they hold all of them. Wilke means the same speech that they from home took. And if you know German, then that Nome is very familiar because nehmen is to take in German. Notice the verb hold. Speech here is given a kind of tangibility, a thingness. It becomes like a rock or a book that you could hold in your hand. Language is something that people hold on to. Even when they move, they hold their own language. And the reason that they hold on to their same language is for but a man con French may tell of him lute. For, unless a man knows French, I account of him little. Con here means know. It's related to kin, as in the people you're related to, your kinfolk, kinship. French, notice here, is spelled with two S's, even though if you go up 1, 2, 3 lines, it's spelled F-R-E-N-C-H. Spelling had not been regularized by this point. Let's go back to that important word, tell. This is not tell in the sense of tell a story or tell about what happened last Tuesday. This is tell in the sense of bank teller. The teller at a bank is the person who counts the money. For unless a man knows French, I guess the best way to render that in modern English is I account little of him, or I reckon his worth to be little. Here Robert switches from talking about the Norman French to talking about the native English. Ac lowe men holdeth to English, and to her owe speech yet. Ac is a wonderful Old English word that has not changed one bit. It means but low men. And now we have the counterpart to the high men. So the high men are Normans, and the low men are the native English, the Anglo-Saxons. And they are also doing their own holding. Just like the Normans, they are holding to English and to their own speech yet. And that yet is very significant. After several hundred years of hearing the aristocracy speaking this foreign language, they are holding on to their native language even yet. And Robert himself is returning to a new version of that language. Notice that idea of possession, their own speech. We own our speech. It's one of our most prized possessions. Robert then digresses from his history to make some observations. In fact, it's rather a lament. Each wayne there ne baith in all the world countries none that ne holdeth to her own speech but England own. I think there not beeth in all the world countries none that not hold to their own speech but England alone. Notice his first person pronoun, each. Back in Old English, that was I-C with a fronted C, pronounced each, and now it's written I-C-H. I've mentioned German several times. I-C-H is exactly how modern German spells I, and it's said ich. Ich wayne is I think, and what Robert thinks is that England is in a unique position in the world and in history, and that position is that they do not speak their own language in their own country. And you can tell how insistent and even how upset he is if you look at the number of negatives. I think there not be in all the world countries none that not hold to their own speech but England only. That's between 3 and 4 negatives. And as we've discussed, in English, before the modern times, one negative is negative, and more negatives are even more negative. Ac well me wot, for to con both, well it is. For the more that a man can, the more worth he is. But well I know, for to know both is a good idea. For the more that a man knows, the more worth he is. A reflection on linguistics, on language learning, and on personal value. So even better than holding on to your native language is to be bilingual. For, and here's his reason in the last line, for the more that a man knows, the more worth he is, the more value he has, if he knows both the language of the high men and the language of the low men. So read through that excerpt one more time, now that we've gone word by word through it. I think you'll find that Middle English is a lot more familiar to us, and it's familiar because of the way Germanic Old English was transformed by the very events that Robert is describing.